While Charlie's just setting up the software, I must say I feel a bit, thank you very much, I feel like I'm in a bit of no man's land up here between oh, okay, well I lift it up, right. Oops.
Sorry,
there.
Down a bit more.
Sorry. Okay, is that better? Right, I was just saying, I feel a bit like I'm in no man's land between the two vested interests. But an Austrian colleague of mine in the office described it far better. She said, you're in a bit of a buffer zone, a bit like Austria in the Cold War between the East and the West. However, thanks very much to Joe Mulholland for inviting me here today. It's my first time in the McGill Summer School, and I'm delighted to be here talking about a topic I think is very, very important to our long-term recovery and prosperity. As Patricia said, I am a member of the National Competitiveness Council, and I see our chairman, Don Thornhill, in the audience, which is great. But I hasten to add that the views in this paper and presentation are very much my own views, and Don will take no responsibility for them. Okay, we're going to talk about how we can get the economy competitive again. And I suppose just in terms of background, really, I feel it's important to just set the context. And I apologize if you've heard some of these points made already during the week. I suspect you have, as many of the topics that are covered address some very important issues, which is good that there's some consensus during the week on a lot of some consensus, at least on some topics. However, just to set the context for my presentation, I think we all know that there were a host of international and domestic factors that caused our current situation. I think since 2000, really, our economic growth was really based on credit-induced bubble, which was really not sustainable and has left us now with an unprecedented level of private sector debt, which in a sense really, I suppose, was what financed government expenditure over recent years. So it's a bit delusory to suggest that a government public debt has fallen when it's really based on an unprecedented credit bubble. We know the banking sector difficulties that are out there. We've heard a lot about them during the week in terms of the establishment of NAMA and other restructuring of the banking system. But when it comes down to competitiveness in business, I think what's important is that businesses and consumers can secure credit to finance spending, and at the moment we know they're having difficulty in doing that. In terms of the domestic economy, we have consumer sentiment at very low levels. Demand is declining. We saw retail sales figures out last week, which suggests that retail sales volumes are down 15% in the year to May, following a reduction of 21% in the year to April. So we have very, very weak demand in the economy, very, very low consumer sentiment. We have the added problems of rising unemployment. And depending on what measure you use, whether it's the live register, or the household survey, both of which have different definitions of unemployment, we have somewhere between 419,000 if you believe the live register. We have probably the household survey measure at the end of March was 223. That's probably up to around 250,000 at the moment. So we have rising and unrising. We have a difficult unemployment situation, which we mustn't forget about. The Exchequer finances we're all well aware of. The overall deficit now 20.3 billion, which is 14.1% of GNP. And you know, if you go back to just January, we were talking about a deficit of 9.5% of GNP. And just a few months previously, in October, we were talking about a deficit of 6.5% of GNP. None of those levels are sustainable, and there's a risk, if we don't do something about it, that we'll be talking about a figure that's greater than the higher than 14.1% in terms of the deficit. We have a medium-term budgetary programme now following the publication of the McCarthy report, and I'll say a bit more about that later. But with all of those problems in terms of the weak demand in the domestic economy, the banking sector and the difficulty of securing finance, the rising unemployment, the deterioration of the finances, we have a major problem in terms of our competitiveness. Our economy is uncompetitive, and that is damaging our export performance. And remember, Ireland is a small open economy and relies on exports. We lost track of ourselves in the last number of years. where we relied on construction, which accounted for about a quarter of the economy, 25%. The rest of Europe, it's about 10 or 12%. So we lost the run of ourselves. The fact is we need to grow our exports if we're to have grow in the future. The economy is to grow in the future. So that's the background. And just to show you how the background really translates on a chart, which really demonstrates here the change in our economic fortunes. This is the quarterly GNP over a period from 2005 to 2009, the most recent data for Q1. And you can see the last 3 bars on the chart show you the sharp acceleration in the rate of contraction in the Irish economy. It seems that, from what I said earlier, most of the risks really are on the downside. We've had serious contraction in the economy. GNP in 2008, the economic activity contracted by 2.8% in the full year 2008, which was the first recession since the early 80s. The economy, just by contrast, over the period 2000 to 2008, the average growth in the economy was just 3.7%, so fairly modest, just under 4%. But if you go back to the period 95 to 2000, the economy expanded by an average of 8.7%, almost 9% per year, which is really unprecedented in economic growth terms. So we're now faced with a situation where the official forecasts from the OECD and the IMF are saying that the Irish economy will contract by a cumulative 14% over the period 2008 to 2010. We've already seen 2.8% of that in 2008. And interestingly, you know, how the economy changes. I mean, we do an economic consensus which looks at all the forecasts from 14 economists and various groups, what they're saying for the Irish economy. And just back in October, they were talking about GNP of plus 2%. And they were mostly forecasts made around September, August, September, October in the previous 3 months. So now we're talking about probably around minus 9% for this year. So yes, we have a very contractionary, deflationary economy. And there's a risk if we don't do something about it, we'll have more deflation, which is what David Begg was talking about earlier, or the risk is there. So this talk is about competitiveness. So do we know what we actually mean by competitiveness? I mean, David provided a few quotes there, which were very interesting, albeit he said many of them are suspect. But we, however, in the National Competitiveness Council, which I don't think are suspect, we define our national competitiveness, as you see there on the chart, as all those factors that impact on the ability of the enterprise base in Ireland to compete in international markets in a way that provides the Irish population with the opportunity to improve their quality of life. So yes, David is right. It is about the firms, it is about the enterprise base, and it's about ensuring that all the factors are in place to allow them to compete efficiently and effectively in the international market and sell their goods and services and make profits and employ workers, etc., etc. So that's what competitiveness is about. It's really not just about costs and prices, which is kind of the traditional way people think about competitiveness. Now, both of those factors are very important, but there are many, many dimensions to our competitiveness, which I'll come back to. The NCC and indeed many other bodies and agencies have warned about competitiveness issues since the early part of this decade. Now, competitiveness is, the loss of competitiveness is not new. You know, the recession is only 2 years old. The loss of competitiveness has been around for a number of years. And I'm really surprised at much of the coverage of late in the newspapers talking about it as if it's only a problem that's arisen in recent times. And that is not true. As you'll see later, we've been losing competitiveness for quite some time. And we haven't done very much about it. There is really a need to restore our competitiveness of our exporting sectors because, as I say, we're an open economy and we need to attract inward investment and we need to sell our goods and services in international markets. Our future prosperity really depends on our exports and growing our exports. So just to explain to you, when I say competitiveness has many dimensions, I think this competitiveness pyramid, which is really an analogy that the NCC, the National Competitiveness Council, uses, which I think is a very good one, and really tries to capture the umbrella of measures that determine what competitiveness is all about. It's not just prices and costs, there's a whole host of other factors that lay the foundations for doing business, if you like. And the way we can explain this, if you like, look at the pyramid. At the bottom of the pyramid, you have the key policy inputs, which really cover the three pillars of future competitiveness: the business environment, and we're talking about tax, regulation, finance. We're talking about physical infrastructure, which really is, businesses require good infrastructure in order to go about their business, whether it's roads or whether in order to transport their goods, whether it's broadband, etc. So it's about physical infrastructure, and it's about knowledge infrastructure, which is very important, really covers the whole investment in education and training, which I'm not going to talk about today because I know you have another session about it tomorrow, but it is an important pillar of competitiveness. The second layer in the pyramid are the essential conditions, which I suppose are the metrics of current competitiveness. And here we would put in business performance, trade, investment, productivity, yes, prices and costs are in there, and labour supply. And at the top of the pyramid, really, we have sustainable growth in living standards, which really are the fruits of our past competitiveness success. And I suppose ultimately, sustainable growth and improvement in our living standards are the reasons why we should pursue the national policy objective of being competitive. So how competitive are we? We have a lot of people telling us we're such and so many percent above or below our competitive position and talking about a lot of numbers. But if you bear with me for a moment, I'm going to try and answer this question as to how competitive we are. There are many, many measures around about competitiveness, and the one we tend to use here really is the measure which is done by the Central Bank of Ireland. It's called the Harmonised Competitiveness Indicators, and I'll explain that in a minute. But that suggests, and there's a chart coming up, which suggests that the Irish economy was most competitive in January 2000, and it was least competitive in April 2008. So if you take between those 2 points, it suggests that we've become uncompetitive to the extent of by 35%. The reason being higher consumer price inflation. Throughout the boom years, we had capacity constraints, labour market pressures, so wage rates increased and other prices rose very rapidly. And, of course, the appreciation of the euro, which damaged our competitiveness. If you look at wages, and I spent some time on this trying to get good data on our income levels, our pay rates, our unit labour costs, our wage rates, whatever you want to call it, and we have to be very careful in how what data we use. There's some conflicting data around from some sources internationally, the Commission and Eurostat. So we have to be very careful that we're using the data and that it's representative. But if you take data that I quoted here, I think it's from Eurostat, it shows that the average unit labour costs in Ireland grew by 5% between 2000 and 2008, and 3.3% in the euro area. The Irish harmonised consumer price index, which is what we use to compare ourselves with the rest of prices in the rest of Europe, was up by 3.2%, and in the euro area it was up by 2.3%. Our other measure of CPI, which we use at home, which is got mortgage interest payments and other factors in there, was up slightly higher by about 3.8% over that period. Now, we've had some improvements since April 2008, particularly because it seems now that labour costs during 2008, the growth would have been slower than in the rest of the euro area. And of course, in 2009, the likelihood is that wages are going to decline and incomes are going to decline in 2009. In fact, some figures would suggest that the unit labour costs in Ireland could fall. I've seen figures of 7% in 2008, and if in the Eurozone, they're expected to go up, I think, by about 3 or 3.5%. You could be seeing a 10% improvement in our relative costs in terms of labour by the end of this year. Some people think the 7% is a bit high, but it's going to be somewhere between 5 and 10%, given that wages are going to fall in the Irish economy this year. And we can see that because we're seeing the scale of the unemployment. There are really few pressures or no pressures in the labour market at the moment, and it's easier to hire labour than it was 2 years ago. The IMF have actually stated that we are 15% above the long-run average since 1995, and that actually is the figure you derive if you look back over the period since 1995 and take the average and compare the current level. It's 15%, so mathematically that's correct, but it doesn't necessarily mean we have to adjust by 15%. Okay, so this is the chart, and I put up the chart. So if you bear with me for a minute, I think I'm going to just talk about this chart for a little while. This is the chart of indicators, of competitiveness indicators. And what it does is it actually isolates the effects on competitiveness of exchange rate movements. And what it does is it takes the average of our exchange rate with 56 trading partners, 56. Now, those that we trade most with obviously get a much higher weighting. So it's looking at the effects of exchange, our relative exchange rates. How competitive are we versus our trading partners? That's what the nominal line, the blue line, is doing. The pink line says, in real terms, how competitive are we? So we adjust for our relative differences in inflation, and that's the pink line. And the blue line, which people don't really look at, is using what they call a producer price index to adjust it in real terms, not a consumer price index. So if we just look at this chart for a minute and take the first part of it, which is 1995 to the period 99, all the lines are close together. Why? Because really we didn't have a competitiveness problem over the period 95 to 99. Our consumer prices were rising in line with our trading partners. If you take the next period, 99 to 2002, we had a substantial competitiveness gain. As I said earlier, we were most competitive around October 2000. And the reason for that was a depreciation in the value of the euro. And we had, despite acceleration in consumer prices, incidentally, we had a very strong improvement in our competitiveness. And we were most competitive at that point. If you take the next period, really since 2002, where we had, you can see, a very unfavourable movement in our competitiveness. This is because of rising relative prices and the strengthening of the euro. But what's interesting in this chart is if you look at the blue and the green line since 2005, and you use producer prices, the lines are very similar, which suggests to me that producers were very competitive with their trading partners. They were price takers, so they were competing competitively with the rest of Europe. But look what happened when you use the CPI. The pink line goes way off on its own because of the fact that we had a boom in the economy, we had labour market pressures, we paid ourselves a lot of money, and we increased prices quite considerably, particularly in what we call the non-traded sector of the economy. So the gap there represents the relative, movement in Irish prices, the disadvantage in terms of CPI. And I think, the most uncompetitive position there is in April 2008. We've improved since, and but we've a lot more to go to get back, if ever we will, to where we were. So that's just a little lesson on competitiveness. So that's really what we're measuring when we talk about competitiveness. You could argue that that chart actually doesn't have all the other dimensions of competitiveness in there that I mentioned in the pyramid. It really is, although of course people who are selling goods and which is going into the consumer prices, like electricity, to be fair, is in there, energy costs, waste management costs. So in a sense they're in there indirectly through the CPI, and our non-pay costs have gone very uncompetitive over the last while. So that's the competitiveness situation. I suppose really the question is, what do we need to do to get back to being competitive? There are a number of things we can do. I'm not going to cover them all here, but it's clear that reversing our disadvantaged position requires a substantial reduction in our wages and in our prices relative to our trading partners. Now, the NCC have published a paper looking on getting fit again, looking at how we might restore our competitiveness. Some of the measures are here, but all of these measures really are pretty much, some of them are similar to the NCC in that I agree with them, but there are a few others that are in there that are my own, and I feel strongly about, so I put them in there. So very briefly, we need to restore stability to the public finances, and we need to broaden the tax base. Just on the first one, I say here we need a national expenditure plan. And you wonder, what the hell is that? What I'm talking about there is we have the McCarthy report. We have $5.5 billion of measures to cut our expenditure. We have a menu of choices, but somebody has to prioritise. What do we do first? And what do we do later? This is a programme, a budgetary programme for the period to 2013. So it's all very well to throw that out there, and it's a good report, it's got some good ideas in there, but somebody has to decide what are the priorities. We cannot do it all in the first year. And I think that's why, rather than a national development plan, which we worried about for the last 10, 15 years, we're now talking about some set of plan of priorities about cutting expenditure. And I think you have to start with the largest components. Our public sector pay is 39% of the revenue we take in. Our social welfare is 41% of the revenue we take in. So if you don't start with the largest components, it seems to me you're wasting your time, because you have to start if you really want to get your expenditure and your deficit back under control. I've called here for an up-to-date benchmarking of public and private sector wages, and indeed public and private sector, also with the public service wages of our trading partners. And what I think that should do, it should actually stratify wages in the public sector. It should actually, it's not a question of everybody takes a drop of 10%. I think you have to look at a stratification of wages and incomes. And you will find, I don't know, but possibly that people at the higher level are earning much more than the private sector, or indeed their equivalent in other countries. And people much less, at the bottom end may actually be earning a lot less. So you need to stratify it and decide how are you going to share the burden of the cut in public service pay. And that's difficult. And I think that requires, I heard people talking on the radio about reverse benchmarking, but it's more complicated, and you have to stratify wages and incomes and decide how you're going to distribute the burden of the reduction you're trying to achieve. Because competitiveness is a function of both the private and public sectors, I think that's everybody, it's both sectors. Review and broaden the tax base. Now, I say review the tax base, and we have the Commission on Taxation report coming out shortly. And, I think we have to review our tax system first. It's a big job. The first thing you have to do is to ensure that you have a fair and equitable and it's an optimal tax system. I don't believe we have in some areas. So that's the first thing you do. And the second thing you have to do is you'll probably discover there's a need to broaden the tax base because we've had such a dependence on property taxes over the last number of years. But you review it first, and then you realise we need to broaden the tax base. And then you have to look at other options. And you may redistribute some of the tax that you're collecting already from one person to another. I'm suggesting here, I'm very much in favour of a property tax, and I have been for many years. I think it's a very fair system of getting people to pay for the services that they consume in their local areas. For the past 10, 15 years, we've had development contributions, and I'm always fascinated with how the local authorities come up with their development contributions. They just take a basket of the infrastructure they're going to do in their local area, and they decide we're going to build 100 houses, so 100 million divided by 100 houses gives you your development contribution. And the person who's buying the new house pretty much bears the whole cost of that, and the person who's living in the estate in the house for the last how long is bearing no cost. So I think a property tax, abolish stamp duties and have a proper property tax, which is again needs to be brought in very carefully, it needs to be fair and equitable, and the tax needs to be properly distributed. We also should look at if we need to broaden it. The other option is raising revenue from user charges. I do think that it's important to retain the competitive tax wage. That's, in other words, retain the position between what the employer takes home and what the employee takes home and what it costs the employer. And I think we need to retain that wedge, because we have a serious unemployment situation, and income taxes really shouldn't increase any further. Okay, this is probably an odd one to put in here, because you're wondering, why is she talking about capital expenditure under competitiveness? I think this is absolutely important in the current climate because we have this serious unemployment situation. But this is based on some work and a submission that we did for the Construction Industry Council, which was looking at, I suppose, generating some sort of a stimulus for the Irish economy, as there is no other stimulus on the table at the moment, and unemployment is rising quite rapidly. And what we did is we looked at the option of getting pension funds to fund much needed infrastructure. And there's a big report about this, and I only have one slide to talk about it, but essentially what it is, it's saying if the government, which it has done, cuts quite a lot out of the capital programme, which it has done in the last budget in April. But if it cuts $1 billion, it actually costs the government $510 million anyway, and you get no infrastructure. Why? Because they have to pay $18,000 on average per person on social welfare, and they will lose on average, coincidentally, another $18,000 in taxes from workers. So the 18 and the 18 gives you about 2.6 billion, which is 51% of the 5 billion, so the 510 million is really what it costs the government by doing nothing, and it gets no infrastructure. On the other hand, if it has a stimulus, we've worked out that every 1 billion creates 10,000 direct and indirect jobs in construction. So taking the 5 billion stimulus, you would create 70,000 jobs. You would maintain the highly skilled productive resources in Ireland. More importantly, you will deliver much needed infrastructure, and more importantly, again, at this time, at excellent value for money, with the cost of construction down 20% since the peak. So again, the government gets the tax in of 1.3 billion. It doesn't have to pay social welfare of 1.3. It saves 2.6. The remaining 2.4, where do they go for that? They actually go to the pension funds. And the pension funds have expressed an interest in this. It has no effect on the government balance sheets. It's an off-balance sheet structure. Now, this has gone into government in March. It's the only stimulus package that I'm aware of on the table, with due exception to David Begg, who has one, I think, as well, to promote employment. And more importantly, it provides much-needed infrastructure. You get a significant rate of return on investment in infrastructure over and above the cost. You provide much-needed jobs, and you generate induced impacts throughout the economy. People start spending their wages and spending, right throughout the economy. You have multiplier effects, we call it in the jargon, but you get further induced impacts. Okay, so I think that's worth considering, but there's a whole report around that if you want to look further. I'm almost done. Just really in terms of other priorities, I'll just say, cash flow is critical. If you're in a small business, cash flow is king. And if you don't have cash, you can't run your business. And I think it's very important that businesses have access to reasonably cost finance and that they can secure finance. There are many surveys have been done where it seems that businesses are having difficulty accessing finance and getting credit. I know from the work we did for the construction industry that they're having difficulty getting funds to finance projects, and hence a lot of construction projects have been postponed and they won't be completed because there's a lot of other things going on, of course, in the development fraternity. But I do think cash flow is critical, and the bank restructuring and the bank policy that's underway by government needs to ensure that quickly it starts ensuring that cash flow is available to businesses if we're to get the economy motoring again. Cost, which is a very important, albeit not the only dimension, we need to restore cost competitiveness. And I think here we need to really talk about the very high costs that are faced by Irish firms. It's critical that our firms are competitive for the exporting sector. I just threw out a few measures here, just to show you how we're uncompetitive. I say here on the minimum wage, we're third highest. As some people suggest we're second highest. It doesn't matter. We're second or third highest across 10 countries that we've benchmarked. We are highest. The NCC looked at a range of occupations and discovered we're fifth or sixth out of 16 countries benchmarked in terms of our pay levels. And non-pay costs are critical because these are really what's going on in the non-traded sector, which is really driving that CPI line way above the, into high territory. We had high rental costs, but even though they've come down, we still have the 8th out of 16th highest rental costs in the 16 countries benchmarked. We have the second highest electricity prices in Europe, and have had for some time, and we have waste disposal costs which are amongst the highest. We heard Patricia talking earlier about commercial rates, and so there are significant costs that businesses are faced with and have been faced with for a number of years. Dublin is the most expensive location for legal fees according to work done by the NCC, and the third highest for health insurance. So we have issues there that we need to address. So we need to make some reforms in terms of our non-pay elements, and there's a whole host of reforms around addressing the non-pay side, and I think I can't go into all of them here, but I would just say in terms of the electricity sector, we have to ask the question why consumers are burdened with such excessive price increases. What is going on in the regulatory structure, in the determination of tariffs, that ends up with our consumers paying the second highest electricity prices in Europe? That can't be right. There's something wrong with the regulatory system. Similarly, on waste, the structures need to be clarified, and there's a whole host of other issues around waste which I don't pretend to know enough about, but it is a cost that is faced by businesses. And finally, we have business services, which really, we have to increase competition in non-traded services, legal fees being the classic one I mentioned. And I think for that, we have to use the powers of the Competition Authority in regard to selected professions. They've done some work, and they should be implemented to increase the competition and support the adjustment on prices and wages. And I listened to the coverage of the conference last Monday night on TV, and I saw our Taoiseach talking about we must reduce legal fees. And I thought to myself, The Competitiveness Council has been talking about reducing professional fees for many, many years. We sent reports into Mary Harney when she was Minister. We sent reports into Micheál Martin when he was the Minister for Enterprise. And we're sending them in to Mary Coughlin. So I'm personally, not speaking for the Council, I am very, very frustrated with the lack of action by government on the solid, very solid recommendations that have gone in from the National Competitiveness Council in terms of addressing competitiveness. I have a quote in my paper, which is from a 2003 report, 6 years ago, which talked about many of these issues that are on the table, and still we're talking about what should we do about them. So, I mean, it's frustrating. And, you know, I should add that members of the Council give their time voluntarily. You know, we have no impact on the Exchequer finances. We give of our time voluntarily, and we work hard with the Competitiveness Council, helped by the Secretariat at Forfos, and we do some, I think it does some good work and has made some very solid recommendations. So it's disappointing that we don't see more action. Okay, sorry, I'm almost there. The last one. So I've headed this up, the government clock is ticking. And this was a phrase, not my phrase, that a journalist used on Monday morning when I was travelling to work, talking about the various developers who have been in the news and the various court cases, etc., and ACC and etc., all that's going on at the moment. And I thought to myself, well, that's very interesting, because the government clock is ticking in many respects. It's ticking on the banking situation. It's ticking on the fiscal situation. We need to set a plan out. How are we going to prioritise what Colin McCarthy and his group have come up with? And thirdly, but very importantly, we need to restore competitiveness. And we need a plan of action to restore it and agree, finally, no more reports. We have to agree on what needs to be done, and I've presented some options here. And it's important to have all parties on board in coming up with this plan, and because I think any delays in tackling the underlying problems will only mean a more protracted downturn and more deflationary, more deflation in the economy, which was what David was talking about earlier. So in conclusion, I think we haven't got much done and we have a lot more to do. Thank you.